opening lines of communication and claiming central territory immediately. Establishing central control symmetrically immediately opens up possibilities for both sides to develop their pieces rapidly. Developing the knight here quickly controls central squares, hinting at a king's knight opening. Instantly challenging white's central pawn and opening a tactical avenue for development, this knight's sortie injects immediate dynamism into the game. Gambiting a flank pawn so early throws caution to the wind, inviting immediate tactical complications and opening lines towards your own monarch. Striking at the center, black immediately challenges white's aggressive pawn thrust, aiming for dynamic counterplay. Sacrificing pawn structure opens the f-file, potentially creating attacking chances against black's king, but also inviting a pawn storm. Recapturing the pawn immediately creates sharp tactical possibilities, opening lines and forcing a quick assessment of positional imbalances. Developing this knight simultaneously defends the pawn and prepares castling, creating a harmonious piece deployment amidst the opening's sharp exchanges. Unleashing a bishop to pin the knight immediately challenges white's central pawn structure and opens avenues for further development. Securing the pinned knight and preparing to challenge black's aggressive pawn push, this move anticipates a potential skirmish on the kingside while setting up a clear path for the king's rook to join the fray. Black disrupts white's central pawn structure with an immediate capture, creating a dynamic pawn imbalance and potentially freeing the queen's diagonal. Opening the b-file with the pawn creates a doubled, isolated pawn structure for white, sacrificing pawn integrity for potential queenside pressure, and an open highway for the rook later. Solidifying the pawn chain, black aims to control central space and prepare for potential queenside expansion, but must remain wary of white's central pressure and open f-file. Establishing dominion over the queenside files, white bravely anchors the rook on b1, preparing to exploit any instability on that flank and forcing black to constantly consider counterplay possibilities along the open c-file. Focusing on piece activity, this maneuver brings the queen to a more central, active square, preparing to potentially join the fight on the kingside and offering better support for the knight if it ventures further. Opening the center with d4 solidifies white's central presence and aims to exploit the slightly misplaced black knight, potentially creating opportunities for pieces to become active. The bishop tucks itself away, seeking shelter on e7, a common retreat when the central pawns are locked in combat, but this passive placement may allow white to seize greater central influence and develop their pieces more harmoniously towards the queenside. Creating a defensive shield around the king becomes paramount, as this pawn advance prepares to challenge the bishop's influence. Exposing the king's diagonal by retreating the bishop to h5 creates a temporary but potentially significant spatial vulnerability for black, as the g7 square is now less defended. Developing the bishop to a square that immediately challenges black's queen opens up intriguing possibilities on the queenside and pressures the central pawn structure. Seeking to dislodge that pesky knight and possibly open a line towards white's king, this maneuver also offers a slight repositioning for the queen, potentially preparing for a queenside castling later if the central action subsides. Shifting the queen from its semi-exposed position on e2, this action simultaneously aims to protect the e4 pawn and prepare for a potential kingside advance, while also clearing the path for the f1 bishop to re-enter the fray, creating a more cohesive defensive structure. Reclaiming central influence by anchoring the bishop on a more active diagonal offers black significant counterplay, potentially stifling white's queenside ambitions and preparing for future pawn thrusts. Unlocking the bishop's diagonal influence, white aims to connect the rooks and prepare for central action or an assault on the kingside. Sacrificing the bishop to dislodge white's queen from its strong central outpost and potentially open lines towards the king looks like a bold attempt to inject some dynamism into black's position. While it gives up a bishop pair and simplifies somewhat, it might achieve its aim of creating queenside pressure and freeing black's pieces for more active participation. Consider the ensuing pawn structure. Does this exchange create any lasting weaknesses for white, Or does it simply facilitate white's development and control of central files? Unlocking the c-file for potential pressure, this capture rearranges white's pawn structure, creating an isolated pawn on d3, but simultaneously opening avenues for bishops and rooks along that central column. The knight's journey to the queen side, specifically a6, aims to unburden the d7 square and potentially eye the c5 outpost, a subtle but important positional goal given white's controlled center. Finally, securing the monarch offers immediate safety, removing any lingering worries about that e-file pressure that has been brewing since black's early pawn sacrifice. The castled king now benefits from the pawn shield and the potential support of the rook, allowing white to focus on developing the remaining pieces and potentially exploiting the slightly uncoordinated nature of black's knights. A crucial step to solidify black's queenside pawns and prepare for potential queenside expansion. This move quietly aims to support the queenside structure against white's central influence and the open d-file, while also freeing the c8 square for potential piece development later. White jolts the position with this knight sortie, aggressively targeting the f7 weakness and putting immediate pressure on black's vulnerable king. It's a bold attempt to disrupt black's developing harmony and exploit the slightly exposed nature of the black monarch, aiming to initiate a kingside attack that could prove decisive if black doesn't find a precise defense. Liberating the bishop from its pinned position initiates a strategic exchange that could redefine the pawn structure and open up new avenues for piece activity on both flanks. Capturing the bishop eliminates black's primary attacking piece from the kingside, simplifying white's defensive structure while leaving the pawn chain somewhat exposed and the king potentially a target. Initiating a knight maneuver towards the kingside, this placement aims to eventually bolster the central pawns and contest the now open c-file. Aggressively seizing the open file, Rf3 immediately aims to bolster the kingside and prepare for potential breakthroughs against black's somewhat passive pawn structure, hinting at a strategic shift toward more direct attacking play. Navigating the central chaos and eyeing the weakened kingside, black repositions the knight to a more active square, hinting at a potential sortie towards white's vulnerable king. Opening the central file for the rook immediately elevates its potential, targeting black's somewhat passive kingside defense and adding pressure along the now open column. 19. Rf8 redirects the rook to a more active file, anticipating a potential pawn push on the queenside or seeking to support a future central advance. This maneuver subtly aims to improve piece coordination and challenge white's central dominance by preparing to contest the f-file, a crucial conduit for attacking the king. The bishop's journey to h4 aims to disrupt black's rook's comfortable positioning, forcing it to retreat and potentially opening lines for white's pieces. Observe how this repositioning might influence the struggle for central control, and whether it indirectly prepares for a future pawn push or knight maneuver. Safeguarding the monarch from potential threats on the kingside becomes paramount now. This pawn's advance creates a crucial escape square for the king and simultaneously bolsters the kingside pawn structure against further incursions. Pioneering advances on the queenside signal an intent to seize territorial advantage, potentially disrupting black's cramped development. A strategic reoccupation of the open c-file, offering the rook more active placement and anticipating potential pawn pushes on the queenside. Unlocking potential in the queenside rook file, the bishop now retreats, offering a dynamic repositioning that may hint at a future queenside pawn advance or simply a subtle shift to avoid any immediate skirmishes. Black boldly challenges the center, injecting immediate dynamism into the position by opening the c-file and seeking counterplay against white's pawn structure, aiming to disrupt the coordination of white's pieces. Challenging the central pawn structure, this capture cracks open the position, potentially forcing concessions. The pawn sacrifice on the queenside is accepted, opening a diagonal for the rook and creating dynamic counterplay. Unlocking the c-file presents an immediate opportunity to challenge black's central pawn structure and open avenues for white's pieces. Challenging the central pawn structure with this pawn advance immediately opens lines and aims to disrupt white's queenside control, seeking active piece play rather than passive defense on the queen side. Opening the c-file with a bold pawn thrust dramatically alters the board's geometry, potentially creating persistent pressure against black's queen side and offering white an avenue for active piece play. Recapturing the pawn, black initiates a dynamic counterattack, challenging white's central pawn structure and opening new possibilities for their queen. This bold maneuver aims to exploit the potential weaknesses created by white's recent pawn grab, potentially disrupting white's coordination and forcing them onto the defensive. The queen's new central presence, poised for action, signals a shift in the game's momentum towards more tactical skirmishes. Opening up the g-file for potential rook activity, but what of the vulnerable king? Black repositions the queen, recognizing the pressure on the d-file and seeking a more active square, potentially to support a pawn advance on the queen side or prepare for further piece development. Reasserting pressure along the b-file, this maneuver prepares to challenge black's potentially isolated queenside pawns and discourages any early b5 ambitions, forcing black to consider a unified defensive structure. Reclaiming central influence, black reintroduces the knight to a more active square, threatening to destabilize white's pawn structure and open avenues for counterplay on the d-file. The rook's relocation to the f-file aims to consolidate pressure along that open column, preparing to potentially double them and attack the black king's defenses, while also offering a retreat square should the g-pawn advance and threaten its counterpart. The knight's audacious journey to the 5th rank, seeking active play and a potential outpost, ignites a fierce central struggle, challenging white's control of the d-file and probing for weaknesses in the pawn structure. The immediate recapture opens lines with aggressive intent. The queen's capture offers a temporary material parity, but it reintroduces a subtle vulnerability on white's light squares, particularly the weakened c4 pawn, which might become a target once the rooks find more active posts. Suddenly, the rook's descent to the 2nd rank creates a glaring weakness on the queen side, directly threatening the vulnerable black pawn and forcing a crucial decision regarding its defense. A bold attempt to salvage material and create counterplay by infiltrating the opponent's position, though it leaves the king exposed and sacrifices pawn structure for activity. Shifting queen dominance to the central open files and supporting the knight's advance, this repositioning aims to exploit potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure and coordinate an attack on the king. Seizing the opportunity presented by the exposed queen, black dramatically alters the game's complexion by liberating their rook from passive defense and initiating a direct confrontation on the d-file, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and exploit the open central files which now offer tantalizing attacking prospects. A brilliant discovered attack from the queen on c6, forcing the black king to relinquish its protective pawn shield. Protecting the king is paramount, and this square offers a temporary sanctuary from the immediate storm of checks while aiming to regroup the shattered queenside defenses. Unveiling the king's vulnerability, this discovered attack forces black's monarch into a precarious central position, begging for further exploitation by white's coordinated pieces. Revealing your monarch to this degree invites disaster. While it aims to defend the rook, it creates a glaring weakness on the dark squares leading to your king's sanctuary. Dislodging the entrenched knight from d4 unlocks attacking potential along the now open c-file. Unleashing the knight to its central outpost, this advance aims to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and potentially open lines for counterplay. Black shrewdly seeks to exploit any lingering weaknesses around the white king, which, despite the pawn shield, might feel exposed given the active rook and bishop. The knight's new posting forces white to acknowledge its presence, likely dictating white's next defensive steps, and potentially sacrificing a tempo for proper repositioning. This could be the start of a dynamic phase where positional advantages are tested by tactical possibilities. Unleashing a powerful discovered attack, white's queen targets the exposed enemy monarch, aiming to disrupt black's defensive setup and potentially force material gains. The king's desperate scramble towards safety is hampered by the awkward placement of his own pieces, leaving it exposed to a relentless barrage of discovered attacks and potential mating nets forming on the dark squares. a daring thrust that aims to rip open Black's defenses, creating immediate threats against the exposed king, and potentially launching a decisive attack by sacrificing material for initiative. Unleashing a desperate counterattack, Black seeks to disrupt White's attacking momentum by sacrificing material to expose the enemy monarch, hoping to exploit the now open diagonal for the queen. A desperate gambit, sacrificing a piece to expose the enemy monarch and potentially force a perpetual check, or a messy, unpredictable continuation where anything can happen. The monarch retreats into the shadows, a desperate attempt to shield itself from the looming storm that has engulfed its defensive perimeter. This maneuver sacrifices valuable tempo, but aims to regroup against White's relentless cavalry and bishop battery now poised to exploit the weakened kingside. The king's plight worsens as the bishop intercepts its escape, forcing a desperate retreat and highlighting the severe weakness of Black's central pawn structure, now exposed to relentless pressure. The king's escape route is severely compromised after this check. White has effectively trapped the Black monarch in a mating net with pieces poised for a decisive assault. A decisive blow is delivered, immediately addressing Black's exposed monarch and forcing a king shuffle that offers no respite. The king, exposed and adrift on the 7th rank, faces an immediate and undeniable threat. Black's decision here, while seemingly forced to avoid mate, surrenders control of crucial squares and accelerates the inevitable collapse of his position.